Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We are glad to have you with us. I'm Emily Sumner, and I'll be your host today. Before we get started with today's discussion about connectivity and student engagement, I'm going to go through just a few housekeeping items and logistics to help the webinar run smoothly for you. First, we will be accepting questions throughout the webinar, and we will hold a Q&A with the panelists at the end. You can use the questions box on your control panel to send your question in, and I'll put it into the queue to be answered during that Q&A period. We do have a lot of panelists with us today, which we're excited about. So if you do have a question for someone specifically, if you would just include their name along with the question, we can make sure that gets directed to the correct person. If it's for everyone, that's great. But if there's someone particular you want to hear from, just let us know that. We don't have a group chat today, so anything you write in that questions box will just be seen by me. But again, if you've got questions for that Q&A period, we'll get to them at the end. We certainly hope the webinar runs smoothly for you, but one thing you can do right now to try to avoid some technology problems is to close all of the other applications on your computer. So Word, PowerPoint, any Adobe applications you have open, close all of your internet browser tabs. This just helps all of your internet and computer bandwidth go to webinar, and this can really smooth out video and audio lags. If you do have any problems, you can use that questions feature to get my attention, and I'll do my best to resolve the problem for you. We are recording today's webinar, so if you're not able to stay for the whole thing or would like to share it with colleagues, keep an eye on your inbox tomorrow for a link to that recording, as well as other information and resources. All right, I think we've taken care of all of our housekeeping business, so we'll go ahead and meet our panelists. We are pleased to have Carl Hooker with us today. He is an author, speaker, educator, and former school technology director. Welcome, Carl. Carl is joined by Dr. Margaret Gotsky, who is currently Chief Education Strategy Officer for Verite Group. Hi, Margaret. Margaret previously served as Deputy Assistant Superintendent of Early Learning and Head Start State Collaboration Director for the District of Columbia Public Schools, and also held several other positions within DCPS. We also have Harrison Parker with us, who is Vice President of Operations for NetRef. And we are very excited to have Dr. Ricky Taylor join us. Ricky is Chief Academic Officer at E.L. Haynes Public Charter School in Washington, D.C. She has also served as Assistant Superintendent for the School District of Philadelphia, as well as a principal for many years in the District of Columbia Public Schools. So welcome to all of you. We are excited to have this conversation today, and I will go ahead and let Harrison get us started.
Thanks, Emily. First off, I just wanted to say to all the educators that were joining us today, thanks so much for everything you did this year. I know it was a different school year, but thanks for everything you did to make it a success. While the COVID-19 pandemic brought many hardships, I think one positive that did come out of it was its ability to shine a light on the already existing connectivity challenge that many of our students are facing today. The FCC is offering temporary broadband subsidies. There have been many public-private partnerships to hand out hotspots for those in need, and it's driving important conversations like the one we're going to have today. So let's jump in. I'll start with the first question here, and Margaret, I'll kick this over to you to start with. So is digital learning here to stay?
Well, thank you so much, Harrison. Well, first and foremost, glad to be here today with Carl Hooker, Harrison, and Dr. Taylor. And I absolutely agree with Harrison. Congratulations for all the educators. You made it through the school year. Thank you so much for all your hard work. And to go back to your question, Harrison, is digital learning here to stay? I absolutely think so. I think we are in the process right now of really reimagining education. And to your point earlier, digital learning will be an integral part of teaching and learning. We've actually seen that during the pandemic. The pandemic has both challenges, but at the same time, there's opportunity. During this has taught us to leverage in a very meaningful way. We've seen teachers, integrating online technology intentionally into their curriculum. We've seen high increase of usage of digital books and ebooks to tailor to the needs of the students. Then we have some students with disabilities or English language learners who are actually using assistive technology in their instruction. We've heard from parents that they have had successful parent-teacher conferences during this time due to remote learning. So these are really great practices, but I think we also need to really think that there is a need for a real, internet bandwidth all across the teaching and learning. And I think we know that digital learning is not just limited to the devices and the internet. I mean, we need to really talk about the end users of the technology. So these are the administrators, the teachers, the students, the parents. And I think as educators, we really need to think about how can we further support the stakeholders? How can we continuously, ask what their needs are and really provide the ongoing supports that they need to further enhance their digital learning. So would love to hear from my other colleagues as well. Carl, Dr. Taylor?
Yeah, I mean, I'll reiterate that and also give a shout out to educators this year and also parents. I mean, this has been an interesting year as an educator and as a parent, having my students / kids right here behind me, as we go through the school year. It's been interesting. This question about digital learning is an interesting one. And it's, if you think about digital learning in a larger scale, we've really had it for several decades. If you think about the early work of Apple, in the Teach for Tomorrow program in the 80s, the work of Dr. Ruben Poinadera when he did the one-to-one programs up there in Maine back in 2001 and 2002, we've had some ability to kind of have insight into what real good and authentic digital learning looks like. But we're still kind of just catching up to it. And I feel like this last year, when it comes to the remote aspect of it, was really triage. It was really just like we kind of got thrown into it. We had to figure out what we're going to do. Administrators were trying to figure out what program, what LMS, how are we going to, let's throw a bunch of apps at kids and see if it sticks. So this, in some ways, although it sounds bad, this is really the worst version that we will ever have of digital, especially when it comes to that virtual remote learning. So I'm excited to see kind of how it'll continue to improve now that we've all kind of gone through it. And heading forward into the future. And I think that means a variety of things. It starts with what you were just saying, Margaret. I think the connectivity is a big part of it, and we'll get into that in a minute. But I also think one thing that has been really interesting is, there's a wide range of apps out there, and I'm sure Ricky can talk about this in a minute too. I mean, there's so much stuff thrown at us in terms of like, oh, here's some new programs to help with reading and with math and all these ways to kind of bridge those gaps. But do we know that they're being used well and with fidelity? And also, do we know, and as someone who provides professional learning, I'm always wondering, like, is it something, do we need to be training our teachers better on it to make sure it's being used with that fidelity? Because it's one thing just to kind of put a device, I feel like the easiest thing to do is to spend money on a device and a program and put it in the hands of every kid. The hardest thing to do is to change pedagogy and mindset. That takes time, effort, and energy over the course of a summer, a year, years, if you will, of training. So Ricky, I don't know, I'm kind of curious what your thoughts are on this. I mean, the idea of a digital learning, I mean, we feel like it's, it's definitely ever present, but is it here to stay, and what do we need to do kind of going forward with it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's certainly here to stay. I mean, some children really did flourish during this pandemic because they had access to technology and apps that they normally wouldn't have had access to, because we were slow to begin to dip our toes into the water of what digital learning could really do for kids. But I think you're absolutely right, Carl. I think we threw a whole lot of spaghetti at the wall trying to figure out what would stick. And so certainly we bought all kinds of technology. We gave kids hotspots when we could. And we weren't able to provide the digital literacy to go with the digital learning, right? And so we have students who didn't know how to access technology at all, which is a huge problem. And we think about reading and writing and science and social studies. We didn't really factor into curriculum, digital learning and closing that digital divide and really thinking about those aspects of literacy pre-pandemic. And now we're all sitting around thinking, well, that didn't really work, but it got us through. So what do we need to do now? And I think teachers same way, right? So like 1 minute they're teaching from a chalkboard, and the next minute we're asking to utilize, great apps like Nearpod and Pear Deck and other things that I'm just beginning to learn about this year. And so now we have to figure out, okay, so let's take 100 steps back, figure out how well did this thing work, who did it work for, and how do we now prepare our community to receive all of the stuff that we've now entered into their worlds and have expected them to be great at, and didn't really have the time really or the capacity to train them in the ways that we should have.
And I would say it's important too that dipping the toe. I mean, it shouldn't be understated. I mean, we tend to build the plane as we fly it in education, and I always say perfection is the enemy of done. So you know, it'll never be great or perfect, but the fact that they did it and the moves that we took this year, even if it was, we may have to take that 100 steps back, like you're saying, Ricky. I think that's an important step. The other thing I'll throw in real quick before we kind of move on to the next question is you hit on something there, that there are kids that have succeeded, and I know there's a lot that didn't, a lot, but there are kids that did succeed, and I think it's interesting. And this is probably for another webinar, but I mean, state legislatures right now around the country and state board of educations are deciding what should be and should not be allowed next year. I mean, here in Texas, a bill just failed that basically said that virtual learning would be an option for public school students. So, you know, that's going to be another kind of a sticky, as we move forward into this, I guess, 21st century, now that we're 21 years into it, we should start moving into it. It'll be interesting to see like how policies and procedures also kind of align with this new belief of what digital learning looks like. And then how do we know that kids are online, or how do we know that they're attentive to what they're doing? And I know we'll talk about that a little bit too, some of the stuff that NetRef does, but I think those are all questions that we're still kind of thinking and figuring out as we roll through this.
Well, Carl, I think that's actually a good segue. And Dr. Taylor, I was going to pass this over to you. And is the echo better on my end? I just switched the headset. I heard I was the problem child.
Yep.
So
You sound better.
Switched it. Good. Well, but Carl, that was a good segue there. I think so. Dr. Taylor, what is the current state right now of the digital divide? And you were starting to get into that a little bit earlier, but I'd love to dig in there and see what it's like in your school in particular.
Yeah, so as you guys know, I work in Washington, D.C., and I worked in Philadelphia for a couple of years before returning to my hometown. And so when we think about the current state of the digital divide, I'll speak from the urban communities from which I've worked. And it looks a lot different than it did 1, 2, 3 years ago. And so because of emergency legislation and emergency funding and reappropriating funds, most urban schools were able to provide one-to-one devices, especially in Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia, to their students. Many students also received hotspots, right? And so the divide now looks different because kids no longer, some kids have access to technology that they didn't have access to before. And so that has changed the playing field. And I know we'll talk a little bit about connectivity, because having a hotspot doesn't necessarily mean you have great connectivity to the internet, which has certainly been a problem for education this year. But I think the divide now is around family understanding of what technology does and doesn't do. And so I spoke a little bit about the literacy piece, right? So we didn't make kids as literate as we should have. There's certainly an opportunity for us to work with families and parents specifically around their literacy around technology, because there's some fear factor there. There's certainly some levels of understanding that we need to get families to in order to help their students have access not only to their education, but like Carl said earlier, and so did Dr. Les Gotsky, about families having connection to the school that they didn't want to have, right? And so families who had that level of literacy and their level of comfort with technology were excited, right, about being able to connect with their teachers in different ways. And families that weren't were still a little bit nervous. And teachers, certainly, we need to continue to provide professional learning to get them as literate as we can on the many ways that digital learning can support what they do in the classroom. So we really need to make sure that families have permanent access to technology, which the divide is going to come when people return those hotspots, right? And then that schools are continuing to use their funds, whether it's the new ESSER funds or other state funds or local funds that come from their organizations, to continue to support hotspots and one-to-ones. And we also need to make sure that we're investing continually in quality curriculum that has digital companions. And so no longer are the days where you open up a book. We never know when we are going to have limited time quarantine or limited time. We have to go back to having virtual learning for a short or long-term basis, depending on what's happening with health indicators in our city. So we have to constantly be prepared for that. And so how do we then begin to prepare our teachers and our students for it? By making sure that we have access to curriculum that has some of those digital companions.
Absolutely agree, Ricky. I just so love hearing from a practitioner because you're in it every single day. But I absolutely agree with everything that you said. We also heard a lot from the school districts that we work with about it's not just about issuing devices, it's really providing reliable internet, not just hotspots, but really continuously reliable internet to students. And I think we also heard from schools that they would want to make sure that they have the ability to monitor those internet access in a more regular basis and not just a one time so that they can actually provide the right supports and resources for the schools. And Harrison will talk more about the internet bandwidth later on. But I think, to your point, Ricky, this pandemic really has brought this urgent issue on internet. And to Carl's point earlier, this is not a new issue. We've had this even before. Before it was more related to homework gap or, the to your point, the disparity between urban versus rural and who has more access to the internet. But the pandemic really has brought more attention to that at this point. Even in some schools, we've actually seen students struggling with reliable internet and they have to go to public places like libraries, parks and recreation, the school's playground, even to access the internet. A lot of schools right now really have stepped up and did even short-term solutions to help the students. Like we've heard about school districts converting their school buses to mobile hotspots to help their students. So these are really creative ways. And I think Dr. Taylor, to your point earlier, it's inevitable that we're going to have disruptions. There will be snow days, so in those days schools were thinking about, oh, should we do digital learning during those snow days? Are these kind of the creative or best practices that we have learned over the pandemic that can be carried over for even when students go back to school? And I think absolutely to your point, Dr. Taylor, the disparities based on economic status has been very evident, that students coming from low income families really need more resources to have access to reliable internet. And I think this digital divide goes beyond our students. To your point, Dr. Taylor, it also has affected families, especially when it comes to affordability. And I think that's the reason why I feel that reliable access to reliable internet is a necessity. It's an essential utility that should be affordable for all families. So would love to hear more thoughts from you, Carl.
Yeah, I started thinking about what you were just saying, Margaret, about the snow day too. Like, is the snow day over? Are we ever going to have that again? Or should we? It's funny, my own kids said that they got excited. It was near the end of the school year. They got excited when there was a lightning storm outside. And I was like, why are you excited? He's like, because if the internet goes out, that means no school today. And I'm like, wait a minute. So we have to address some of that too. It's true. I mean, if there's a power outage or an internet outage, I mean, those will be the new things that kind of disrupt schools. But it's also amazing to me, thinking about this bandwidth gap, I guess, so to speak. I mean, I think the hotspot idea, again, kind of a triage idea. It was like, let's do it, and it was what we had available to us. I know of a lot of schools and organizations that are partnering with internet service providers. They're doing partnerships with businesses, and I think that model may be more sustainable going forward in terms of us, our school districts giving out devices, just because some of those devices I know come with caps or limits. And so when we get back to the bandwidth idea, if a student's watching Tiger King all day, then they've burned up their bandwidth for the month, which I still have not seen that show, but that's a whole nother topic. So how do we shape that traffic, or is there ways that we can control it? And I love the innovative approach of the buses that you mentioned, Margaret. I've seen a lot of that. And I think we're kind of doing our best. I still think there's something out there, and maybe we're not there yet. And maybe it's going to be Elon Musk with his internet everywhere thing, or kind of the wideband internet that can go miles within reach. And maybe that's the future, because I work a lot with urban schools, but I also work a lot with rural. And those schools, yeah, it doesn't matter if you have a hotspot, there is no connection. There's nothing. So they have to do a lot of offline learning. And so I think that's going to be kind of the next big thing. So yeah, watch out for those thunderstorms. Snow days are a thing of the past. I'm excited. We'll see how that goes. But in my mind, it makes sense. So I don't know if y'all feel the same.
Well, Carl, I'm gonna step in for the kids everywhere and say that snow days should continue for just a little bit.
They want it to stay. They were like, Dad, what are you talking about? And it never snows.
But I do like the idea. Yeah. I do like the idea of the thunderstorms there. Well, Carl, I guess to continue on your point you were making there a little bit. So what's the fallout from connectivity from poor connectivity from all the districts and schools you've been talking with across the country that they saw this past year?
Well, I mean, it starts with just absenteeism. I mean, even if you just talk the simple idea of like a kid being actually engaged with what's happening online, the second they can't connect, the second they're frustrated with it, you know, adults, we all experience this when a call is lagging, when the audio and the video quality is really poor. Especially audio, I've heard, you know, feedback from teachers, you know, they say, you know, if we need to, we can turn off our cameras as long as you can still hear me and see a little bit of visual. I think that helps. But if that's really shaky, you lose kids, you lose adults, you lose everybody. So I think when you have that weak connectivity, it's just going to affect everything. So those kids they're checking out, they're not as involved, they don't feel as listened to, they don't feel like they can actually, they feel like they can't be heard because they probably can't because their internet is slowing them down so much that even their teachers are like, we're sorry, you're going to have to just you know, turn off your camera and maybe you can hear this later. So they feel really disconnected, not to use the pun, but I mean, I think that's kind of the feeling that I got from those communities, especially those that I've worked with that have really had struggles with this, where they're trying to get kids in like areas, even if it's just like a little cohort of like 3 or 4 kids in an area that has better internet, and saying, hey, can your families kind of group together so we can get some better internet for these kids? Because that was it. That's their lifeline. That was their lifeline into learning. And I think going forward, as kids are moving back into schools, what's going to happen is that homework gap that you guys mentioned is going to continue to be an issue if they can't get access to that high quality bandwidth. It's just going to continue to be a problem. And those kids, again, are going to feel disenfranchised, disconnected, and they're just going to say, like, you know what, it doesn't work here, so I'm just not even going to try. And they'll try a few times, but after a while, I don't blame them. You know, after a while, you're kind of like, well, how many times am I going to get burned with this where the internet will go out and I can't do the work? I'm curious though, Ricky, are you feeling that? I mean, you're in a very, I guess, obviously a very dense community, so you got a lot of bandwidth there, public bandwidth, I imagine too. But I wonder if you guys saw some similar things with that disconnection or that disconnect when the bandwidth was an issue.
Oh, definitely, definitely. So absenteeism is definitely a factor, not only in this school, but in other schools across the city. Um, I think this just general disengagement, because I think you're right, Carl, when you can't when you can't access it real time and there's lulls and lags, it definitely leads to like a decrease of engagement. We definitely have quality public bandwidth in lots of spaces, but when you're talking about people's homes and apartments, or there are 4 or 5 other students in the home trying to access the same hotspot, it becomes a real concern and issue. And so we have definitely experienced like lack of engagement in many of our students who really are visual learners, auditory learners, and really appreciate and need that connection for them in order to be successful. And I mean, absenteeism, especially among our older learners, like the younger children, sometimes have a little more like stick-to-itiveness, or their moms are just next to them saying, "Get on there and try again." Our older students are, you know, quick to disengage. So we've been also experiencing some of that frustration as well. And even in our own school, and this is a newer school in a, you know, populous community. Yesterday, we had issues at our staff meeting because there are 200 people trying to get on, and we couldn't access the graduation video we wanted to show and all of those sorts of things. So we also saw lack of engagement among our staff who were trying to right, pay attention. And we had a virtual 8th grade promotion last night, because that's how 8th grade promotions are now, for the 2nd year in a row. And beautiful young lady who was singing, we could not hear her. And so we had to like stop in the middle and try to get it together. And she was in the school going live. So these are not just things that are happening in people's homes. And then we had some issues with the connectivity of our interpreters with families. So we had to stop the ceremony again to make sure that the interpreters could appropriately connect so that families could understand and hear what was happening during the ceremony. So it continues to be a concern, even in, you know, schools that are just a few years old, when everyone is accessing technology at the same time, or, you know, we need infrastructure that we didn't know we needed 15 months ago. So yeah, it's a concern. Wondering, Dr. Liz Gotsky, how has this manifested in the conversations that you've had with educators and administrators across the country?
I 100% agree with you, Dr. Taylor and Carl. I mean, we heard from students about their experiences, same experiences as you guys have described, the kind of the frustrations of of being in a lesson and then suddenly your computer freezes and you cannot hear anything. And we even have actually some students who told us that they'd rather actually not participate in the video conference to save their bandwidth and just participate in the audio so that they can at least hear what is going on in the classroom, which is, it's unfortunate that they have to kind of, make that choice. Some of our students even said that, not just by using cell phones, sometimes they go to their relatives that have a reliable internet access to grandma's place because they have more access there, to the internet. And so, I mean, we are talking about all students, and we really haven't really surfaced the fact that we also have students with disabilities and students who are English language learners. I mean, they struggle as well in having access or issues in reliable internet. I mean, they need to think about the content and the things that they have to learn, but it can be even more frustrating from them to actually deal with other technical issues. And I think for educators, I definitely agree with you, Dr. Taylor, in terms of the frustrations of the educators too. We also heard from teachers that they spend about 15, 20 minutes of their time troubleshooting before they can even start a lesson. But at the same time, a lot of educators have just become very responsive to the needs and being creative. Like some educators would say that, they prefer doing some audio or one-on-one meetings with their students, or sometimes some educators would actually reach out to their students even after the lesson to just help with the troubleshooting so that the next day the student will be ready to participate in class. I mean, educators have gone above and beyond to actually help students, especially for those ones that need reliable internet. We even heard from teachers that they've actually recorded the videos because they know that some students cannot access it in real time. And some teachers also would say that they have tailored their instruction in such a way that instead of asking the students to go to a website that has high, or will entail a higher internet bandwidth, they would rather just give them another instructional material for their homework, or giving them printed materials, or even I even have one teacher who said that she even puts her lessons in a flash drive and videos in a flash drive and take it to the students so that the student can actually access the videos at home in their own devices, and instead of downloading it from the internet. So these are really creative ways that I think our educators have done over the past year, but I definitely agree with both of you. I mean, the frustrations out there, the disengagement of students and the staff, and I think there just needs to be a lot more conversation on both short-term and long-term solutions on how to address this digital divide.
And Carl, have you heard any thoughts from other folks out there in terms of some approaches that we can take as we move into this school year and the next 5 years, 10 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big one for me that I've been learning about is, there's kind of two angles at this. There's the short term, kind of the patchwork, which a lot of us did, which was, the hotspots or putting it on the buses and things like that, or finding some local businesses that are willing to open it up. But I do think the long-term idea here and strategy, it's going to have to involve a lot of partners, and starting with community partners, but also local, state, and federal partners in terms of, this should be like electricity, guys. I mean, at this point, it's 2021. At some point, we need to think the internet is just, I don't know that it's a right, but it definitely should be available to everybody in this country, just because of the power of that connection and the ability to pull kids out of those underserved communities and give them access to things that they maybe never had access to before. And so I think on the long-term side of that, some of the things I've heard a lot of schools doing in various states, Illinois stands out as one that's kind of out there right now and kind of in front in some ways. And that is that they are looking at ways to give, whether it be not necessarily free access, but definitely a lower cost access with partnerships with like the Spectrums of the world or the Cox Media Cable, those kind of things. So some sort of lower, just for K-12 students, that is. So families that have K-12 students have access to that internet. And I think they're figuring a way to subsidize that. I think that's a start to a longer term solution. And then of course, the bigger one would be like, of course, free internet for all, which would, maybe Elon Musk will throw those satellites up there and it'll happen. But I'm waiting to see if he gets to Mars first. But what about Margaret, or either of you guys, if you want to jump in on this? Margaret, do you think there's an idea here, like how do we, besides some of the short-term stuff, and again, you and I are both working with schools across kind of all over, and not only in this country, but in other countries too. So maybe there's approaches that you may know of that I haven't seen yet. but in terms of both the short term or long term.
Yeah, absolutely agree with you. I think the short term, and I think a lot of schools have been doing this a lot, is to really listen to the stakeholders who are the end users of the technology. I mean, I think that's the first and foremost that schools can actually or have been doing it right now. Listening to their teachers, to their students, to their parents, to their community partners of what their experiences were during this pandemic and what were those best practices and solutions that have been implemented over the past year, and actually learn from it and really kind of have the conversation of what are the best practices that can be carried over even when we go back to the school. I think that's the first thing. And then I think having these conversations too will also spark the discussion about what digital skills do teachers need, do students need, do parents need as we continue to move forward with education. And then the second part of the short term is the infrastructure. I mean, we've seen that, to Dr. Taylor's point earlier, that schools actually have given devices and hotspots and mobile, but those are kind of short term. But how do we sustain those resources, right? What happens if the computer suddenly doesn't work anymore? What is our plan B on that one? Will there be continuous resources for the students and for the teachers as well? And then the other one too is for parents. I mean, we've heard so much in this conversation about the impact of digital learning to families. How do we disseminate information to families intentionally and really making sure that they are part of this conversation? I mean, we know that we have the emergency broadband program. So how do we share this information to the broader audience? And I think absolutely agree with you, Carl, to your point about the long-term solution. It's the partnerships that we needed to have, not just with public educations, but with community-based organizations, even with the vendor community or service providers. I think these are long-term solutions that I know a couple of school districts have already started exploring to kind of see how can they partner with service providers or vendor community to actually think about ways to collaborate, either to share resources, to share funding, to share grant opportunities, or whatever that collaboration may look like. But I think schools cannot do this alone, honestly. I mean, there needs to be more collaboration with public entities, with the government officials to really push this internet issue and resolve this forward. Ricky, do you have anything else to add? I'm sure you have all the magic answers here.
Yeah, we're waiting, Ricky. Give it to us all.
I don't, but I will give you some of my thoughts. Well, number one, I think for the short term, we really have been fortunate enough to receive ESSER funds for next year and over the next 3 years. And so I know we took emergency funds and we bought one-to-ones and we gave kids access using hotspots. We need to continue to do so. To Dr. Margaret's point, right? Like, they will break, and it is not worth the hassle of trying to fix a $300 Chromebook when we should just make sure that we're continuously investing over the next 3 years and beyond with the funding that we do have to continue to provide access long term for students, whether it's a hotspot in the short term or definitely access to the technology and the hardware. I think a short term and a long term goal, as both Carl and Dr. Gotsky has said, is definitely investing in infrastructure, right? And so even if it means your school, some of the ESSER funding can be utilized to support infrastructure, and we need to at least make sure that the best hotspot we got is the one in our school building, because I love the idea of like the satellite thing that's going to really save the world and save the internet, and it can't wait for it to happen once he returns from Mars. But meanwhile, we really need to make sure that at least kids can access the internet while they're in the school, and in the short term that we're creating spaces and opportunity for kids. They can wear a mask, right? Lots of them are getting vaccinated at this point. How can we create the opportunity for kids, whether it's in the evening or the morning or even on the weekends, when the world does open back up, to have access to the internet in their own communities? I think is really, really important. I think the partnership piece that both of you spoke about is super important, because you're right, schools can't do it on their own individually, right? And so how do we partner with community-based organizations and our own local and state governments to really provide infrastructure that's going to meet the needs of the 21st century learner? I think long-term, and I guess I should have spoken to this short-term too, is I think Margaret's right. I think we need an ed tech plan. I think I think the states need them. I think the local government needs them. I think schools need them, right? And I think we need to hear from our communities, curate what their needs and wants and values are, hear from them what went well this year and what didn't, because we're only guesstimating because the end user is the person who we really need to hear from. And then, right, like work your plan. Once you've developed your plan and heard from your people, decided what your goals are, what's your real plan and why, right? So that you can continue to invest because you're reconnecting your plan with your why. Like, why is digital learning so important? And I think we've spoken about all of those things today. I think you're right also, Margaret. I think digital literacy for families and connecting families to the internet is super important, right? Because kids don't live at school, and it takes a community of people who are able to access the internet to ensure that we have great education for all kids. We also need to reinvest time as we're thinking about social emotional curriculum for next year and all the wellness opportunities that we need to create, and the intervention opportunities we need to create for uninterrupted instruction. We need to still consider digital literacy for our students so that they're able to access all the internet has to offer. And then I'll just offer this again, and I've said it before, we really need to begin to invest in quality curriculum that don't just meet your state standards, but also have digital companions so that when we do have offline, I'm a fan of no snow days. Teachers who are listening, don't get mad at me. But I also am a fan of kids going outside and playing in the snow. So like there's this tension that's going to exist for the next 100 years in education. So have a snow day, the second one, can we at least read a novel? So that's what I'm a fan of. But when in times of crises or snow days, or all of the other things except the storm days that Carl spoke about that I hadn't even thought about yet, we need to be able to connect our kids to what they're learning in quick ways to support them.
I think that's a huge point. That high quality curriculum too. I think we barely touched on it, but I mean, when you think about a high quality curriculum that's inclusive of all, I think that's something else that we need to touch on. One thing I'll say is, in my time as a director of innovation and looking at internet bandwidth in my communities, the way we gathered that information is essentially, it's through surveys, and it was like asking questions, so I never really knew, honestly, if that data is 100% accurate, because it was just whoever responded. And honestly, if you don't have internet, it's hard to respond to a question that's online. And so I'm excited to hear a little bit, because I know that Harrison had told me a little bit about this thing he's working on, that they're working on at NetRef, about this bandwidth report. Because for me, I think a lot of the stuff that we said during this call was important. I mean, Ricky, I think you said something about throwing spaghetti and seeing if it sticks on the wall. That happened a lot with our hotspots. A lot of the schools we work with, we threw hotspots out there and said, hopefully we're getting everybody. But we really didn't have the great data to say like who had it and who doesn't in terms of that bandwidth. So Harrison, do you want to tell us a little bit about like what does that report look like? I mean, I've just seen like one little screenshot of it, so I'm curious to see what it looks like.
Sure. And I was getting ready to describe it and use all my hand motions and all that, but rather than do that, actually, let me just share my screen. So let me jump out of this PowerPoint here really quickly, and then I'll share my screen and I can walk you through that bandwidth report that we're getting ready to release in about 9 days. So.
Although I think an interpretive dance about the bandwidth report would also be interesting for our viewers. Wait, I've got to tweet Elon Musk right now because of what Ricky said earlier. I got to say something to Elon and see what he says. No. Save us, Elon, when you come back from Mars.
Now, for the interpretive dance, you're kicking off the music, right? So I can do this while I'm showing you the program too. I just need a little bit of music.
There we go.
Okay. Can everybody see the screen now? I think so. Good. Okay. So as Carl mentioned, and let me give those that we just kind of switch gears to show you this bandwidth report. So for those on here that don't know anything about NetRef, I just wanted to provide a little bit of background for you on that. So one, we're a classroom management tool. So we give teachers the ability to see exactly what's going on devices. So for those districts and schools that have moved to one-to-one, like Dr. Taylor was talking about with Chromebooks or Windows devices or whatever that device may be, we try to empower teachers to be able to see what's going on, and then more importantly, focus attention on just the websites you want them to be on. So when you talk, Dr. Taylor, you were talking about earlier about absenteeism and distractions and engagement being a big issue that we've seen this past year. On that side of the house for classroom management, that's where we really try and provide power to the teachers so that they can, again, engage students on that educational content when they're using their devices. So the other side of the house for NetRef that we try to help districts out with is on the learning analytics side. So on my screen, you can see in the top, it says NetRef reports. This is where we aggregate all the data that you would see on those Chromebooks or those Windows machines and show you, hey, are we getting a good return on investment on our ed tech programs? We're using this math intervention program. Which students are actually using it? Which students are falling behind? Dr. Gotsky, to your point about ELL learners this year, hey, we've added Rosetta Stone, or we're using another program like Imagine Learning to help out with ELL students. Are they getting the time needed in that program? So there's a lot of different things that we provide here on the reporting page to help administrators too. And one of the new things that we're adding on July 1st is the bandwidth report. So part of the conversation we've had is really just identifying those at-risk students. It's difficult to know who's got good connectivity at home. When you're a teacher and you're assigning homework and it's web-based, which of your students may not be able to access until they come back to school the next day. So as part of the NetRef program, this school year, we've embedded a speed test into the program, and I'll show you how that works. So if I'm an IT director, I can select 2 times a day that we run that test. It could be 5 p.m. and 7 p.m., and that way we get a good gauge on the connectivity of those students at home. And all you have to do the next day or the next week, I'd recommend a longer period of time just to get more accurate data. But if you're looking at it for at least a month, let's say, you can come in here. We'll start with a school, and we're going to pick the fictitious Smith Middle School here. And then I can just set the download speed and the upload speed that I want to get the threshold on. So now I'm taking a look at all the students that either exceed 4 megabits per second in download speed or fall below it. And in the top right, you can see I've got a date range. So I can run this for whatever date range I want to. If I want to look at it for last week, for example, I'll just click this orange button here. And now what you're getting is all the students that have met that threshold. Now you can see everyone in this example has exceeded 4 megabits per second, and we've got everyone exceeding the 2 megabits per second. But let's say that's not adequate. We know that to support a Zoom call, it might take 3 megabits per second, or we know that we're using so many applications for ed tech that it's going to be higher, like 10 or whatnot. So I'll just increase it here just a little bit so you can see what happens when students fall below that threshold. But you'll get a red flag here for the students that don't. So this is kind of a bad example for you to see because it was all or nothing, right? But sometimes that's the case for your students. They're right on that fine line. But you'll see a little red flag that denotes when they don't meet that threshold. So this is the bandwidth report. We're super excited about this. We're offering it at no cost for districts to try out. And really, any of the features that I'm showing you here, if you guys want to get started for summer school or roll it out into the fall, you can get data on this bandwidth report as well as some other neat things. And I don't want to show you everything. We don't have time for that, but please reach out to us if you're interested in learning more. But I did want to show you the engagement report because it ties in again to what Dr. Taylor was saying about students being disengaged this year. You can use the bandwidth report and I think tie it with this other report, which we've deemed the engagement report, where, okay, we know their connectivity, right? So if we see students and they're connected, it doesn't necessarily mean they're engaged, right? They could be on Netflix for that hour instead of being on IXL or another learning program, right? So when I run this report, again, we've got a number of different filter options. We'll this time choose the classroom. We're going to look at East High School, and actually I'm going to switch gears and log in really quickly on a different system so we get more data there. Bear with me. I just realized that this is the new version that we've got here and we don't have any data, so otherwise I would show you all nothing. So let me sign in here.
As you're signing in, Harrison, can I ask you a question too about this?
Yeah, shoot.
So, a lot of this, sometimes, there's the idea that seat time, we talked about this, I think in a webinar that you and I did a long time ago, that they have to be on at a certain time of day or anything like that. Is there a way, and maybe you're going to show this, but is there a way that you can actually see like when they were engaged, or is there times we can kind of say like, okay, we want to know like after school, now our kids are in school, but they take the devices home. So I really just want to know what they're doing from like 4 to 9 or something like that. Is there a way that you can do that as well?
Yes, you can. So you can drill down and look at that hour by hour, and you can do it on a per program basis. Now, what I pulled up here is actually aggregated data around the engagement tag. So tags are just ways that you can filter in our system. You can see here now that I've switched over to our system that actually has data in it. But for engagement, in this example, I've added 20 websites behind the scenes and tied it to engagement. So you can imagine if you're a school district or an individual school and you've got all these educational programs that you've either spent money on or that you know move the needle, you want to make sure that your students are actually spending time in them. So with this report, you can then pick a particular classroom. You could look at a school, or you could look district-wide. But for this example, we'll use the Spanish class, and we'll say, hey, we've got all these programs we pay for. I want to see how many students actually spend more than 30 minutes a day on these programs. And again, I can run this report for any time frame. I'm going to look at last week. And when I do this, I'll get a really neat chart here in this case that shows how much time they're spending on these sites that I've chosen. So you can see 20% of our students were engaged last week in the programs that we want. Probably not the right level that we want, so you can get with the teacher, or you can get with the students in this classroom and figure out what was going on. If I scroll down, you can see we mark a student as A for absent if they don't meet that 30 minutes per day. So we've got a lot of students in the class that aren't meeting that threshold. If you see that they're not meeting that threshold, there could be a lot of things going on. This is where you can tie this report to the bandwidth report, and maybe it's simply a connectivity issue. You're assigning a lot of these activities at home, and they don't have access to the internet, or maybe they've just had such a tough year that they're totally out of it and they're just not engaged. So this is a really neat report that I think can be combined with the bandwidth report to get more stats there. So there's a lot more reports obviously in here that you can drill down to specific websites and time on task. As I mentioned, I'll show you really quickly, just so you get an idea. This is the classroom management side to NetRef. So again, it's just a quick visual indication for teachers to see, hey, what are my students working on, and are they on task? And then there's tons of controls to be able to manage the websites they have access to and ensure that your team's getting the most out of ed tech programs. But I know we're kind of running out of time here, and I want to make sure that we have enough time for questions for our panel here. So let me stop sharing this. And I just wanted to wrap things up really quickly here, because I know we talked about a lot of great things. Primarily, one is that I think we've all agreed that digital learning and the gap right now is pretty prevalent. And there's a lot of different things that we can do to support our students in the near term and long term. But we need to keep having these conversations so that we can come to a better agreement as to how to approach those, and maybe try a lot of different strategies. And who knows, we can get together next year and see how far we've come. And it's going to take a lot of partnerships. Dr. Taylor, you mentioned that, we're going to need the ISPs help. We're going to need corporations. We're going to need the school entities. We're going to need parents. So I've loved the conversation today. Before I kick it back over to Emily to field those questions and any that have come up, don't forget you can chat those right now. So if you have any questions, enter those into the chat. And then Emily, please feel free to direct those to anyone else on the call right now. And then lastly, I did want to follow up after the demo that I just showed you and let you know we are offering this, both the bandwidth report, the engagement report, any of the features you saw in NetRef at no cost for summer school or as you move into this fall and next school year. So don't hesitate to reach out to us.
Well, thank you to all of you for this great discussion, and such an important one as we plan for the coming school year, which will be here before we know it. But we do have some questions that came in, so we'll just go ahead and take those. The first one was directed to Dr. Taylor, and a question around what kind of professional learning are teachers at your school doing around technology this summer to help them build their skills and do better with digital learning?
Thanks for asking. So one of the things that we did in the short term to make sure that teachers had access to professional learning around technology is we invited some of our teachers who are really great at it to become tech leads. So they get a stipend from us and they're able to give more personalized learning for some of the apps and platforms that we already use. So they will have professional learning, both new teachers and teachers who are returning around our LMS and around some of the platforms that we've utilized. Our biggest push this summer is really going to be around simulcasting and live streaming. And so we remain virtual almost all year. The last quarter, we invited some of our most vulnerable students to come back to in-person learning, but that ended up being about 10% of our population. And so we, in our district, as in the district Carl spoke about, our mayor really has said virtual learning is really only an option for students who receive a medical certification to be at home. And so we don't know, there's not lots of guidelines for doctors around what that looks like. So we're preparing for up to 10 to 15% of our community to still be at home, depending on what specific medical conditions would require them to be at home. And so we have invested in some of the OWL technology and all of those other components that help them simulcast or live stream should they have to. And so that's what the big push is going to be this summer.
Yeah, does sound like good plans and lots for teachers to learn. So yeah, that professional learning will be very valuable. Carl, are you seeing anything with the schools you're working with around what they might be doing to prepare teachers?
I saw what I've seen mostly is there's a pause moment that I haven't seen in previous summers where schools are saying we're going to take a pause and give you a second to regroup. And I think burnout is real. I think it always is, but I feel like this year especially there's a lot of teachers that are just kind of tired of everything. So taking that little pause and break, I've seen a lot of that. So most of the districts I work with have taken a lot of June and said, we're going to just wait. We're going to wait until July and we'll regroup in July and get started. I've also seen a big shift toward that online on-demand learning, PD in your PJs or whatever they want to call it. Essentially letting teachers kind of throughout the summer just take learning as they want to. Maybe they're on a road trip, they can listen to a podcast, things like that. I feel like they're starting to get a lot more creative with it because it used to be in the olden days, and I say this is 2019, olden days, you would only get counted credit if you were sitting for 6 hours in a workshop room, and it's funny to think that was just a couple of years ago that most schools insisted that. But I do like that a lot of schools now have opened that up to say, you know what, if you complete a certain amount of coursework, if you're watching these videos and you're actually doing something that's going to integrate into your classroom, that digital learning with high fidelity, I think that's the new trend, and it probably should have been happening, honestly, a decade ago, but I'm glad that it's starting to happen now.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that it could be one of the bright sides coming out of this pandemic is people are a lot more aware of how effective some of these virtual things can be and don't have to be so leery of them. So that's right. Good. Harrison, a couple questions about the bandwidth report. Is it testing just student-owned or school-owned devices, or does it work on student-owned devices as well?
This would be on school-owned and district-owned devices, yeah.
Okay. And we touched on this a little bit, but maybe just refresh everyone. How do you know when you run the report if that bandwidth that's being reported is being tested when a student is at home versus at school?
Sure, so it's based on times. So if you are setting it up, you would typically, if you just want to report on times when students are at home, so that would be later in the evening. Of course, we don't know where that student is at that time. So the nice thing about that too is that we can report basically during any time frame. So whether a student's at the library, they might be with a relative's house and not at their own house during different times. So over the course of a month or a couple of months, you can really get a good grasp of what the connectivity is like during certain time frames for those students.
Yeah, that's good flexibility to get a pulse check many different times and places. So this is a question for all of you. So maybe Dr. Taylor, starting with you, just since you're working most directly one-on-one with students at this point, but after more than a year of remote learning for many students, do you have any idea what their perceptions of digital learning are? Are they really longing for more offline learning with books and paper, or are they still just all in with devices and digital programs?
That's a really good question, and I'm going to invite Dr. Gotsky to also give some perspective on that, as she has worked directly with our school and kind of talk with our students, and can give you a little more information about it. But our students are hungry to come back to school for in-person learning. They are tired, they are through. Many of them have had some level of success. I think especially for our older learners and even for some of our students with special needs, this has been a good opportunity for them. And then there are students who are just really ready to come back to school. And I think it's less about the online experience and more about the connection. So they want to be with their friends, and they want to skip down the hallway and do all the wonderful things that they're used to doing. We did offer what we call Lions classes, learning individually while on site, where because if you're in a high school and your kids are not cohorted in many ways, it's very difficult for us to have in-person learning if you're exchanging courses. But we said, hey, come in, you'll still be online, but come in. We got very little response from students. We only, out of our about 480 high schoolers, got about 70 of them to come, because what they crave is that human connection and that human interaction. Meanwhile, when we had our version of Coachella, lots of kids were here, right? So the vast majority. So they really miss being in person. And I'm speaking most specifically around the high school because this is where I'm sitting in this moment, but even our little people are just really ready for connection. And we hear that from their families all of the time. And so they've appreciated the opportunity to connect online, but it isn't for them the same thing. So they're ready.
No, I absolutely agree with Dr. Taylor. We also heard that from a lot of students, and I think, you know, the longing to come back to school is a lot of students say, I miss my classmates, I miss seeing my teachers, you know, and it's great. You know, some students also would say they actually, during the remote learning, they even have, you know, the good experience of texting or emailing directly to their teachers. So some of them even have increased their, you know, collaboration with the teachers that they work with. Some students definitely appreciate the different applications that were implemented, because it really kind of helped them a lot with their learning, and they hope to continue having access to some of those either assistive technology or applications that have actually helped them over this pandemic. But we've also really heard a lot about the internet bandwidth connection as issues with the families. We heard it from students themselves, you know, the ones that we've talked about earlier, that students trying to not use their video to save their internet bandwidth and just, you know, participate online. Those are real issues that students actually face during this pandemic. But absolutely agree. I think they're very creative in the sense that even if we continue our digital learning, I'm sure that there will be some applications that they would love to still continue. But I absolutely agree with Dr. Taylor. They would want to, you know, to go back to in person and hopefully still continue using some of those devices even in school or at home.
Yeah. Carl, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I was just thinking, you know, this is also an opportunity. I agree, first of all, that yeah, the social aspect of school is important, and it's almost impossible to mimic on a two-dimensional screen. I mean, we've done little things, and we have some fun times, but honestly, you can't make that same connections as you're in person. But I'm also starting to think, and maybe Dr. Taylor, when she was talking about this with that class, you know, having the opportunity to say like, hey, for my daughter who wants to take a course in Italian, but her middle school in this neighborhood doesn't offer it, but I know another one that does across the city. Is there maybe some opportunity now where we can start saying, okay, you can go to this room and actually take a course from another teacher somewhere else? That way we're not just necessarily bound by, well, these are the teachers you get because you happen to live in this neighborhood and they're the only ones that want to teach at that school. Now we can have more opportunities within our city, maybe even beyond city, state. I mean, that's kind of crazy, I know, to think about, but sure, maybe there's an amazing teacher in California that wants to teach my kid Italian. that could be a part of that. So I'm curious, like that could be a future. Again, lots of policies and stuff that have to take place for that to happen. But I think that might give us some flexibility going forward. We still have the in-person experience, but also with those cohorts of kids that are taking classes from all over our area. So that'd be interesting. And I don't know if Dr. Taylor, if that's something you're talking about with that Lions group you were saying, if that's what they're thinking about, but I think that's a neat idea.
Yeah, we're super excited about it. Even like small scale, we have middle school kids who need Spanish too, but they're in a different building than our high school kids. So we're already thinking like, let's get schedules together so that they can stay in the middle school and not have to walk the 15 minutes, but they're still being able to take those advanced courses.
Love
and
it.
so we're really excited about how this opens up opportunities for some kids.
Yeah, I was talking to a couple of folks the other day. They said, "Oh, can we actually even think of virtual field trips? Like, you know, people can actually go to community places near their places. But what if we do a virtual field trip to go to Paris or see other places or other countries?" But these are, you know, to Carl's point, outside the box conversations that I think is worth exploring as we continue the digital learning space.
Well, I am sorry to interject into this conversation because it's been so wonderful and I hate to cut it off, but we are at the end of our time today. But again, what a valuable conversation. And I think where we ended up is that there's lots of really wonderful lessons that we can learn from what was a super challenging time with remote learning, no doubt about it. And we're all excited to get back in person. But, you know, how can we learn and grow from the digital experience that we were forced to do with the pandemic and do new and exciting things as we move forward with our students. So thank you again, Dr. Taylor, Carl, Dr. Gotsky, and Harrison for joining us today. And thanks to everyone who took the time to be with us to participate in this conversation. We appreciate it. Just a reminder that the recording will be emailed to you tomorrow along with a certificate of attendance. We'll also include information about how you can use that internet bandwidth report and all of NetRef's other learning analytics reports for free until July 31st. It's really simple to get up and running with NetRef and access to all of that valuable data that you previewed here today. So again, keep an eye out for that email and you can take advantage of that offer. Again, wonderful to spend time with all of you today, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day and have a wonderful week and really take advantage of that summer vacation because you all have earned it in spades. So best of luck to everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.